And we are going to get that engine lifted into that frame once again. Here's all the mounting hardware that we're going to need to finally fit this engine back into this bike. I'm going to get this engine on the jack and off of this dolly, and we'll get it into the bike frame and get it lifted in. What I've done is put a piece of wood here. I have the oil pan off so I have a flatter surface and I have more room because this bike is on the ground. So I need that little bit of extra space to get the engine into this area. The first two bolts I put in are here. This bolt, and there's one here on the other side. And you want to make sure that between the frame mount and the engine mount sections, there is this spacer. There's one of these on each side. Now I haven't completely tightened these, but they're tight enough to hold the front of the engine while I jack up the back of the engine a little more and line up the rest of these through bolts. And then finally we will tighten up this castle nut and we will put the frame sliders back on, and then we will have the engine back in. I was able to get this bolt in. This holds the rear suspension onto the bike and to the frame, and it also goes through the rear engine mount here. Now I never removed or moved this particular castle nut, so I know it was in the correct position. I did loosen the one on the other side, so I've left this out a little bit because we need to do some adjustment to that. And if I bring you up here, it's possible you can see right down in here where my finger is. You can see there's a small gap that we need to close up, and we do that by turning this left-hand side castle nut in. I'll get you set up and do that. What I've got is an H19, it's just more like a 21 or a 22, but if you can see, this is fairly loose, and we're only going to tighten this to about 10 foot-pounds, which is almost nothing, almost hand tight. I'm going to do that right now. And now we're going to tighten up this castle nut on the outside that will lock this in place. And then we can push that larger mounting bolt through and put the nut on the end of it. A lot of people will just take a screwdriver and tighten it, or you can order a tool. But what I've done is I just took a 11/16 cheap generic socket, and I've just cut these two teeth into it that will fit directly in. So I'm just going to use this to tighten that nut up, and then we'll put the rest of the bolts in. I put the washer on, and then there's this last nut that goes on here to hold all this together. And I need to figure out what the torque setting is for this, so I'll get back with you about that. I'm going to go ahead and tighten this off camera, but I'll tell you what the torque setting is and what size this is. This bolt is a 27 millimeter, and it gets tightened to 69 foot-pounds. I'm going to go ahead and do that off camera. I do have a wrench holding the other side. It's a hex wrench, but I'm going to go ahead and torque this down. The next thing I'm going to put on are these mounting bolts here. Now they come with these. These are threaded to put the frame sliders in. The first thing I want to do is I've loosened this castle nut to get the engine in and out. So I'm going to tighten this back up again. It is an H12. I'm not sure exactly how tight it should be, but what I'm going to do is look on the inside of the engine. It meets the engine right underneath this tensioning spring. So I'm just going to look in there, kind of get it set up against it at about 10 foot-pounds, and then put the frame sliders in. I've got this one in, and the bolt that holds it on is a hex bolt, and it is an H8. I'm just going to tighten it down, and then you can thread in your frame slider. That is also a hex bolt, so I'm going to get that in since it's going to take me more than one hand to do so off camera. The engine is in, and I didn't go through every single step on camera, but I will go through in what order I put the bolts in and the things that I ran into putting the engine back in, so that maybe you won't run into a lot of these problems. So I did have the jack. I put a piece of wood here. I still have the oil pan off to have a flat surface and to have, you know, that 2 or 3 inches more of clearance to the ground. I jacked it up and I got it into position. You kind of had to swing it around a little bit, and you had to get these holes in line for this. I did put these bolts in first, one on each side. You can see the other one over there. And then I put this primary swing arm bolt in, and I push it all the way to the other side. And I showed you how to torque down the other castled nut on the other side. Third, I put in both sides. Now these are two pieces. There's this piece, it has its own 8mm hex nut, and this frame slider inside has a 10mm hex nut. There's one of these sets on each side. They went in very easily. The one thing I did have a little bit of trouble with was this bolt. And this bolt is the shock arm. It took two people. So I had one person sitting here holding this bolt ready to push it into the hole, while I lifted on this subframe, this rear subframe, and pushed down on the tire. And that causes that arm to go down. And then the very last piece was this. This is the smaller and long through bolt. It's about 1 foot long. The bolt sits right here, and it runs through the frame, and you can see it right down here. You can see it right there. And if you look, there's a spacer. That's that silver piece right there, or that nickel-plated piece right there. There are two spacers. There's one right under here, and I did end up taking this out to make it easier to get that spacer in. But there are different sizes. There is a shorter spacer, and then there is a longer spacer. The shorter spacer goes on the right-hand side. If you were sitting on the bike, right-hand side. The longer spacer goes on the left-hand side. And then I tighten those down. They're both 14mm nut and bolt. But as you can see, the engine is mounted in the bike now, and we are going to go ahead and put the rest of the parts on. So I've got you set up looking down into the engine bay, and the reason for this is there are a few things that are in here that are hard to get to after we've put everything in here. The first one is this wiring room. So it is this connector, and it contains the speedometer halo effect sensor. This is the neutral safety switch wire. I don't remember what that is. There's an oil pressure sending unit. A very important one, this one with the two yellow wires, is the one that plugs in here. This is the wire, if you remember from the earlier videos, that comes from that halo effect sensor that tells the engine when to spark. So this is the crankshaft sensor, or I think they also call it a pulse generator. In any case, we're going to get all of this stuff installed, starting with this speedometer reader. So it just slides right in here. It has two bolts. You don't need any kind of thread lock or anything on these. These are 10mm. I'll wait to tighten those down. The second piece of this that needs to be screwed in is this oil pressure sending unit. And what we want to do with this is we want to put a tiny bit of gray sealant on here, not past here. So we want to have, you don't want any sealant at the end of this that could get inside here and mess it up. Just a tiny bit of sealant around the edges. So I'm going to grab that. This sensor fits right here. Believe me, it does fit there. So it sits right there. But I'm going to get some sealant on it before I finish screwing it in and tightening it up. I've got the sealant on here, and I've threaded it in. The size of this is a 15/16, or at least that's extremely close if it's not a metric. This does not have to be torqued down. In fact, you'll probably ruin it if you torque it down. So you just kind of want it, hand tight. I'd say that's about 10 foot-pounds. So we've got that in. I have tightened up those two 10mm to about 10 foot-pounds. We'll figure out what else we got to put in next. This is a cover for this oil pressure sensor, and it just slips over just like that. So now that that's in place, I think the next thing that I want to plug in, this pulse generator, and it just plugs directly into this red outlet. The remaining three of these connectors all go on this side of the engine, and one of them goes down through there to the neutral safety switch. I'm just going to hang them off to this side, because what I want to work on next is this positive cable here that goes on the starter. I never took the positive cable out, so it is still sitting right here. I'm just going to set this on here, and we're just going to tighten it down. Just remember that the positive cable comes from the battery to here. The negative cable comes from the battery and hooks underneath. It could be even on this bolt on the top. I put it underneath the starter just because that's what I've done. In any case, positive on here, negative down here. I'm going to tighten this up and I'll be back. The next thing I'm going to put in, if you want to call it the lower heater hose or lower coolant hose, whatever you want to call it, it's the round one. And I put a little bit of sealant. There's an O-ring under here. I'm not sure how well it's going to seal, but this goes right here. 2 bolts, 10 millimeter, just like everything else. I'm going to go ahead and get that put in here. Now this hose runs down and through to the water pump. I'm going to get it put in place. I'll show it to you when it's installed. I've got this hose in place. This one will run to the choke starter. This one runs under the positive cable and down to the water pump, which we have not installed yet. Next, we're going to get this upper hose on, and it runs around here to the radiator. Now I've got the thermostat housing. The thermostat housing has a hose, this one, that runs the same route as the hose we just put on. It runs also to the water pump. It has this one that runs to the other side of the choke starter, and it's got a larger hose that we haven't installed yet that runs to the radiator. This is kind of an oval shaped, and it fits right here. I'm going to need both hands for this, so I'm going to do this off camera. And I have put a little sealant on here also with the O-ring, just because that's what I do. But I'm going to get that on there. I'll show you once it's on. I know I'm going through these really quickly, but we have the thermostat housing on. It's just 2 10 millimeter bolts, one on each side, here and here. And we've got the lower housing on down here. And both have hoses that run around and down on the left side to the water pump. Once we get the radiator on, which will be next, the radiator and the water pump, we will put these hoses in place. So I'm going to get you set up and do that. The next piece we're going to put in is the water pump. And this piece has a slot in this end that sits right on that slot over there. And that is the oil pump end. So these are connected together. The oil pump is driven by the crankshaft and a gear, which in turn drives this water pump. The key thing you want to do is make sure that this lines up with the slot in the oil pump, but you also want to make sure that this O-ring is in good shape. Other than that, there are just 2 bolts like this one. So I'm going to get you set up. We're going to put this in. I've installed the water pump. This bolt, this is an 8. This one is a 10, and I've just hand tight. They don't need to be wrenched down. There's an O-ring behind there that keeps this from leaking oil. You'll notice that this one is a little bit different. I had to go to Ace and get this. This is an M6, so 6 millimeter by 1. I lost it. I don't know where it went. If you remember from the previous videos, we loosened this one to drain the antifreeze. Just going to tighten this one up. So there you have water pump on. The next thing I'm going to do is get a couple of clamps, and I'm going to install these 2 hoses. This one has a clamp already here, and this is the clamp for the larger one. So I'm going to get you set up and we'll get those put on. All I'm really going to do is put the clamp on here first, and then I'm going to push the hose down. I like to have it on all the way. Okay, now we have it on all the way. So we're just going to move this clamp down. I'm just going to grab my screwdriver and I'll tighten that up. I've tightened this one up, and now I'm putting this smaller hose on, and then we'll tighten this one. Just tight enough where it'll squeeze that hose on and you feel secure that it's not going to come off. Now that we have the water pump on, we're going to install the oil cooling unit. The theory behind this is that the oil will run in this section and the fluid from the coolant will run outside this, thereby having the coolant cool off the oil. The pieces are this cooling unit. There's an O-ring. This goes on the other side. And then there's this through bolt that goes in here to hold this on. And this has a washer on it right here. Make sure you use that, or make sure you still have that in place. I'm going to get you set up here and show you how to do this. Now this is a 30 millimeter. So I'll grab the 30 and get you set up. This is clean and it was not leaking before, so I'm going to leave it the way it is. Now you want to take the O-ring and the oil cooler. You want to make sure the O-ring is seated in this oil cooler. And on this cooler where this hose is, you'll notice there is a little slot here. That slot will sit right over this on the engine block. So I'm going to go ahead and feed this through. We're going to just put this whole assembly in place. Now I'm going to tighten it down with a 30 millimeter. We've got the oil cooler on. The next thing we have is this hose. This hose runs around this way and runs into this small inlet or outlet. I bought a new hose for this, so I'm going to grab that new hose and I will not use this one. So I put this new hose in place, and if you notice there is a piece of stiffer rubber right here, and that's because the bend around this oil pan area here on the crankcase is fairly sharp for this hose, so it's to keep it from pinching off. There's one clamp here and there's one clamp over here. I'll do that off camera. Now that we've got the oil cooler and this on, I think the next easiest piece to put on is going to be the exhaust, because the exhaust is going to sit in between the engine and the radiator. I think it'll be easier to put the exhaust on with the radiator off. So I'll get you set up and we'll get the exhaust set in here and we'll get it bolted down. I have the exhaust manifold sitting here. One of the things you want to make sure you do before you put the exhaust manifold on is to put these on. There are 4 of them. These are the exhaust manifold gaskets, and they sit in between here and the exhaust outlets on the engine. So off camera, I'm going to put these on. I'm going to get this set up in here because it's going to take both hands, and I will bring you back around the front to tighten these down. Well, everyone, I nearly made a big mistake. Not a huge mistake, but a mistake that would have cost me an extra step. I was going to put the exhaust on here, and I got underneath the bike and I realized no oil pan. So I've cleaned off this surface. I've sprayed the surface with some brake cleaner and a lint-free towel. So there's no gasket that goes on here. The manual says to put a thin coat, and I'm going to put a thin enough coat of this black gasket material around the outside of this. And then I'm going to let it dry for 5 minutes so that it's just tacky enough, so that when I tighten it up there, it doesn't all squeeze out like a liquid would. So I'm going to do that off camera. I'll show it to you before I put it on the bike. I have put a layer of the black sealant around this oil pan. I'm going to let this dry for 5 minutes, and I'll be back to put this on the bottom of the bike. There's something we need to do before I can put the oil pan on, and that is to put the pressure relief valve here and the oil pickup here. On this oil pickup there is a tab, if you can see this tab, and there's a slot right here, and these just push into place. Drop of oil around the O-ring and it just slides also into place. Now that these are in, we'll finish waiting for that gasket material to dry, and then we'll get this oil pan on. I've got the pan with the RTV on it, and it's dried for 15 minutes. It's tacky to the touch. These are the bolts that hold it on. I'm just going to lift this in place. I'm going to hand tighten these. These are size M6 bolts. Don't try to torque these down. I'm going to, off camera, get this put up here, get these bolts in, and tighten them up. Just hand tight. I've got these hand tight, so I'm just going to kind of tighten them up. But that is oil pan done. We're ready now to put the exhaust on. The exhaust fits between the engine and the radiator, so it's going to be easier to put it on now. Now that we have the oil pan on, everything else is on, the exhaust will come under here, So I think we've got everything in place and we're ready to put the exhaust on. Here's the exhaust. These are the nuts that hold the exhaust on. I believe these are 10mm. Key thing is to make sure that you put these exhaust gaskets in each of these when you put the exhaust on, or you will have an exhaust leak. So there should be 4 of these. I'm going to get this set into the engine and then we'll tighten it down. I've got the nuts hand tightened. There are 8 of these. These get tightened by, according to the manual, 106 inch-pounds. These are 10mm. I'm going to go ahead and do this off camera. You guys know how to use a torque wrench. I've tightened all these down to 106 inch-pounds all the way across. I have also tightened this bolt. Next, we're going to put on, a couple of things have happened since I installed the exhaust. First of all, my camera completely died. Could not use it at all. So I am using my phone. And in the meantime, while I was trying to figure out what to do to record, I went ahead and installed the radiator. It is just a bolt here and a bolt down here. This hose connects to the top of the oil cooler. This hose connects over here to the water pump. I'm going to go around the other side and I'll show you what I've done over there. On this side of the radiator, there are 3 hoses. This larger hose goes through the frame and it goes right here to the thermostat housing. This smaller hose right above the large hose routes through the frame kind of the same way, and it plugs in on the smaller nipple. This third hose routes through the frame also to the underneath of this reservoir. I've got all of those hoses on. I also, on this wiring harness, there's a plug that plugs in right here. So these are the things that I did off camera. Here's another thing I did, just a simple vacuum hose. It's a triple tree vacuum hose. It plugs in here, here, and here, and these just push on. So I didn't think this was really worth filming, putting this on, but at least you can see how it goes. So the next thing we're going to do, the clutch cable. You can see the clutch cable right here. It runs around this way and it plugs in here, or connects here, not plugs in. So I did have to take this bolt out to put this bracket on. This slides through the bracket and then goes into a slot on the back of this connector right here. So that's the clutch cable and the radiator installed. Another thing I did off camera was these vacuum hoses. They just plug into these 2 brass fittings, one here and one here, and they just push on. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get this throttle body set back on. I've gone ahead and installed these 4 rubber pieces for the throttle bodies. There are the bottom screws that hold it to the intake manifold, and there are little notches in the top here. And these notches all go to the front of the bike. They match up with these notches on the front of the throttle bodies. I put it over here, but there are 2 other hoses that we need to hook up right here. So I'm going to get you set up and we'll do that. These are the 2 hoses. One comes from each of these upper and lower thermostat housing or cooling jacket. I'm not sure it matters which side these go on. It doesn't matter which side they go on here. But because one is longer, I'm just going to put it on the back. This one's a little bit shorter, so I'll put it on the front. Just going to tighten up these 2 screws. I need a flathead screwdriver, so I'm going to get that. I believe we've got everything that we need to hook up here hooked up. So now we're going to just set these throttle bodies in place. And it's going to take a little bit of force and shake the camera, so I'm going to stop recording and get this in place. I've got the throttle body in place now. And if you remember from the previous videos, we need a small screwdriver like this to get down in here and just tighten these up. So I'm going to do all of these off camera. I've tightened these all up, and I think we're ready now to plug the injectors in, which is this wiring harness, if you can see it. It has this vacuum sensor, has these 4 injector plugs here, and throttle position sensor. Just run this around here. This first one goes right here underneath, and they just plug in. You can only plug them in one way, so you should hear them click. Make sure you still have these rubber gaskets in the connector. And finally, throttle position sensor. We've got all of the injectors plugged in. We do still have this plug. Now the sensor is already plugged into this plug. This is the sensor. And there's a vacuum line that goes here. And it is the vacuum line that was the extra line that comes off of that spider web of lines right there. It just plugs in there. And you can just tuck it down here, and we will start working on these other connectors. The next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and put the spark plugs in. I'm pretty sure everybody's pretty familiar with how spark plugs go in, but just in case you're not, I'll just do this one. This seems to be the easiest one. This is a 16 millimeter, and it would be preferable if you had a spark plug wrench, which I do have, but it is missing the rubber grommet that kind of holds the top of this. So I am at the point where I'm just going to gently drop these in, and then I'm going to finagle a 16 millimeter socket down into there onto the top of that. So it's stopped turning, and you can see I'm not going to be able to get a socket on here. So what I have is another small extension. Slightly tighten that down. It doesn't need to be manhandled, it just needs to be snugged. I'm going to do the other three off camera. So we've got the spark plugs in place. The next thing to go on are these coils. There's 4, one for each spark plug. They slide in place, and they just set down in place, and they just kind of press in place. I'm going to do the other 2, be back. Now that the coils are in place, we need to plug them in to the electrical system. This is almost impossible to get wrong. These are actually numbered, if you can see. That's a 1, a 2, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. And this just kind of slides in. I'm going to get it around this hose. It's going to take me both hands. These connectors just slide on to these coils. So I'll show you the finished product. So here we have the wire and all of the connectors plugged in to the coils. Throttle body's installed. We've got all of the injectors plugged in, throttle body position sensor, this vacuum hose, and we've also now plugged in all of the coils. We do have one more sensor, and it sits right up in here. And this is the camshaft position sensor. So I'm going to get this in place. It might be a pain in the butt. I was able to get the cam position sensor up in here. It is held in by one 10 millimeter bolt. I couldn't get a socket up here because of the angle, but I was able to get a wrench and just tighten it slowly. So I want to show you a couple more plugs that I've plugged in off camera. So there's the kickstand safety switch, and that plugs in here to this green. I plugged in this temperature sensor. I plugged in this, which is the fan controller. Where we put the cam sensor here, that wire runs through the frame and down here, and it plugs in to this white connector right here. This is for an oxygen sensor, but since this is not a California bike, it does not have oxygen sensors. Also this red one, the same. And I did run this green wire. This green wire runs through down and into this hole down here. That connector right there, that is the neutral safety switch. So if you're looking for that, it's right above the gear shift and down inside the crankcase. I did also run a wire over here, and this plugs in to the brake switch for the rear. We have 99% of the engine connected. We've got the clutch, we've got the kickstand, we've got all of the coolant hoses, everything. But before you get excited and decide to turn your bike on and try to kick it over, there's something missing here. And it is the front fairing. But there's a very important part of the front fairing